Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Capital One Bank, the Wyckoff Group, Greenberg Traurig. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley & Lardner, Friedman LLP, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investment Developers, Herrick Feinstein, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, John Katsimides, Red Apple Group, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knuckle Realty Services, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, MHP Real Estate Services, People's United Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling Risk, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, CUNY TV Foundation, The Moynihan Group, Urban American, and These Friends.
I want to be a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. Maybe I want to play ball. I want to go to Queens College. I want to be an athlete. Come on, I don't know. What is this aspirin? I got Dr. Charles Hennekens, well, AKA Charlie, the man who saved more than 1 million lives because he's the man who is behind the study of aspirin and heart attack and stroke. He's also today the senior advisor to the dean and the Richard Dahl professor at Florida at the Charles E. Smith School of Medicine at Florida Atlantic University. And I'm so happy to have the boy from Brooklyn and Queens, because I got to give you credit in both places over here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Michael.
So tell me a little bit about your grandparents and then your parents growing up, because it's an interesting family history.
My grandparents on my mother's side, both were born in Naples, Italy, but they met each other in Ozone Park, got married. My father's parents, my father's mother, Wilhelmina Schaefer Hennekens, was born in Hanover, Germany. And my grandfather, Charles Henry Hennekens I, was born in Darmstadt, but his parents had immigrated to Germany from the Netherlands. So all four of these people courageously with their parents came to the United States, to Ellis Island around the 1870s, 1880s. And as I said, my father's parents met in Brooklyn and my mother's parents met in Ozone Park.
And how did your parents meet?
They met in Brooklyn because my father was a truck driver driving for a company called Batterman's, as I recall, and my mother worked in the store there, and that's where they met.
What type of store was she working in?
It was a department store, I think.
And now, you have a brother, didn't you?
Well, my family is an extended family. When I was born, my mother and father were already raising my mother's sister's daughter and my father's sister's son. And in addition, my father was taking care of his mother, who had was dying of breast cancer, and also her brother. So we had an extended family. I was the firstborn biologic son of them, but I literally had an older brother or sister.
When you were living in one house, one of the neighbors was a doctor who would go on house calls. Tell me about him.
Well, actually, it was our landlords, the Labashi family, We lived on the 3rd floor of a walk-up at 104 Cornelia Street in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. Their family lived on the 2nd floor, and Dr. Labarshi and his wife on the 1st floor, and he had an office there, made house calls, used to take me. I carried his bag all over town, double parked with the empty plates, made house calls. Much of the time, in retrospect, he might not have been really on top of it scientifically, but I can tell you the feeling I saw, that the patients and the families had such a good feeling.
Right, they always had that good feeling because the old, I mean, today no one knows about that practitioner, you know,
Yes.
who would come to the house.
That's true.
I mean, it's a different world in the healthcare
He was
field.
incredibly dedicated and conscientious, and played a big role in my professional decisions, not only to go to med school, but to go to Cornell Medical College.
Let's talk a little bit about going, you know, junior high school and high school, because you were involved with you were involved with sports, and you were an avid Brooklyn Dodger fan, weren't you?
Well, yes, to go back to my days in Brooklyn, there were so many Subway series between the Yankees and the Dodgers, or the Yankees and the Giants, and the Yankees seemed to win every year until 1955, and that's when Johnny Padres pitched the Dodgers to a 2-0 victory, and 2 years later they were in Los Angeles. And it's just a great gift for Brooklyn to have the Brooklyn Nets here, another professional team in Brooklyn. So I was a Dodger fan, and then moved to Queens when I was 10 years old, and loved to play sports. I played baseball and basketball and soccer
Right, you were in
high school.
Bayside at that time. You went to Van Buren High
Yes.
School. So talk to me about.
But you know, I was in, they had a program called the SP program, so I was pushed ahead one year, so I was with, by the time I went to high school, I was with kids who were a year older than me, and while intellectually I could hold my own, I think physically and emotionally I wasn't up to par, and didn't feel up to par until probably my sophomore year in college.
How old are you when you graduate Van Buren?
16.
You're 16 at Van Buren, and at that time, I mean, even though Dr. Labarski, you had this feeling about it, you wanted to be an actuary?
Well, I was sort of off the map in math. I got practically
793 on your board.
something like that on the board scores, and most in those days who did that well went into engineering. I wasn't interested in that. But my father died. He dropped dead from a heart attack. It was the seminal event of my life to this day, I would
17,
say.
you were 17?
I had just turned 17, and decided that, well, being an actuary would capitalize on my mathematical abilities and get me a good living, because I was concerned about my mother and my brother and what was going to happen to them. But then, you know, my mother then remarried and moved to Florida, and it changed my whole life.
Now, you went to Wharton for 1 year?
I went to Wharton for 1 year and had a really good time. I had a full scholarship there, and enjoyed it enormously. I think it's one of the really finest schools in the country.
And then you go back to Queens College. And Queens College today, I mean, I think you're in 2 Hall of Fames, aren't you? 2 Queens College Hall of Fames?
Well, I am. I guess I'm the only graduate who is in the Achievement and the Athletic Hall of Fame, but maybe it was chance favors a prepared mind, as Louis Pasteur says, because I really walked away from a full scholarship at Penn, where they were willing to move it over into the college if I wanted to turn to pre-med. But I had this passion for sports, and I was captain, most valuable player and high scorer of the basketball team at Queens College my senior year, and co-captain and co-MVP of the baseball team as well, and really had a great experience playing sports. In some ways, I thought it was like David against Goliath, because some of the people I played against later were in the NBA or in the Major Leagues Baseball, and they had full scholarships, and I remember that I was taking chemistry with Dr. Stanley Raydell on a Saturday morning, so I would not miss practices or games.
Now you realize I'm not going to be an actuary. I really want to become a physician. How'd you decide on going to New York Cornell? A fantastic school, no question about that.
Well, I had a lot of, I would say over the course of my career, other than my parents, the mentors I had were so instrumental in my making really good choices in my professional life. And at Queens College, Dr. Donald Lansfield was the pre-med advisor. He was really a funny guy. He loved athletes and came to my games. He watched my baseball and basketball games. He announced to his class one day that I reminded him of Dr. Barry Wood, who was a professor at Hopkins. And when someone asked, well, why is that? He said, well, Barry Wood was the best shortstop east of the Mississippi. And then someone else said, well, who was the best shortstop west of the Mississippi? And Lansfield said, that would be me, Donald Lansfield, who is a PhD in genetics. But he was a major influence on me and most of the other people who were pre-med at Queens. And then again, my personal physician, I was fortunate. I got into every school I applied to in medical school, somewhat intimidated by the possibility of going to Cornell, but I feel it was one of the best things that ever happened to me was going to Cornell Med School. I got a great education. The teachers were phenomenal, and it was just a kinder, gentler medical school like I had never thought it could be.
It's interesting because going back later on in your life, you know, more current day, you endowed a scholarship to Cornell. And what did the dean at Cornell say to you?
Well, Dean Tony Gatto at the time, I was inducted into the Dean's Circle, pointed out that I had been a lifelong academic. I've really only worked at Harvard Medical School, at the Schmidt College of Medicine at FAU. And so he reckoned that I was in the lowest 5% of income, but my donation put me in the top 1% of donors. And my reaction was it was more a commentary on my classmates than me, because what I wanted to do, and I've tried to do that with Penn, with Queens College, with Cornell, and with Harvard, is to give back to them what they did for me, because I had scholarships every step of the way and would never have been able to have gone to these places without the scholarships.
So you finished Cornell Medical. How did you decide you wanted to become an internist?
Well, once I decided I wanted to pursue my passion of being a doctor, I actually started out wanting to be a GP. And over the 4 years of Cornell, I had so many mentors that favorably impressed me. I wanted to be a clinician who was a teacher, an internist. And I was very lucky that I matched at the Cornell Medical Center, New York Hospital, to do my internship and residency in internal medicine, which was a phenomenal experience for me.
And then the military calls, right?
Well, the military called, and I was also, again, Louis Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind. Rulon Rawson was the chief of medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering, one of the affiliates of Cornell. He brought me into his office. What are you going to do when you're finished? I said, well, I'm going to be drafted. And he said, well, do you know about the CDC? I said, yes, I do, but everyone wanted to go to the CDC or the NIH in those days. He said, well, Alex Langmuir was a classmate of mine at Harvard, and he went to Cornell Med School, so he takes a lot of people from Cornell. Let me call him. And Alex said the class was practically full, but I sent in my application and I was accepted, and it changed my whole professional life.
So where do you go? You go to Florida?
Well, I first had the choice of either staying in Atlanta or being in the field services branch, and I chose the field services branch, and I matched with South Florida. That's where my family was. My mother, my brother was there, and I spent 2 years really investigating outbreaks of infectious diseases, and pondered the possibility of staying on long term, but decided it went back to the idea that I wanted to tie up the work in epidemiology with my background in mathematics. So I applied for and got a fellowship to Harvard, and really just intended to stay for 1 academic year and then come back to Florida and practice.
So the program at Harvard was what?
It was a master in public health and epidemiology, and I had an NIH fellowship to go there for the year. But then Brian McMahon and George Hutchison, my thesis advisor, were so inspirational to me that I stayed on as a doctoral student. And then after graduating, because my wife was in a doctoral program at the time, I had to stay in Boston. So I joined the faculty of Harvard Med School with the idea that when she finished, we would leave. But by the time she did, I had such grant support that it seemed like
So explain epidemiology to me.
Well, the textbook
I don't want the
defines
textbook.
it
I
as
want the
you look at who gets diseases by person, by place, by time, and then you try to formulate ideas about what might be causing it and doing studies to try to show that there's an association between an exposure and a disease.
So let's talk about that. How do you find the relationship with aspirin and heart attack and stroke?
Well,
Was this an NIH?
I started out in my doctoral dissertation doing a case control study of risk factors for cardiac death. And one of the risk factors that I found, although it wasn't the major focus of my thesis in the early 1970s, was aspirin. And it became clear that if you're looking for a small benefit, and by that I mean a 20–25% difference, and this is the case for the big life-saving drugs, statins, aspirin, ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, beta blockers. You can only really discern this in randomized experiments. And I met Richard Dahl in 1970 and told him about my interests, and he said, well, death is inevitable, but premature death is not, and basically invited me to Oxford, and I was able to get an NIH Career Development Award that
How long were you at Oxford?
for a whole year. And one of the best things he did was put me in the same room with a young unknown person who is now Professor Sir Richard Peto, who I think is one of the foremost methodologists in the world.
How did the study come about?
Well, it came about because they were starting a study in British doctors, and I was able in the United States to get funds from the U.S. National Institutes of Health to do a much larger and more definitive study than they were able to do, and they actually collaborated with me. But I feel like without the influences of George Hutchison and Brian McMahon at Harvard, and Richard Dahl and Richard Peto at Oxford, and also Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who with Dahl were the first to discover the link of smoking and lung cancer.
So what was how they find out about the link between smoking and lung cancer?
The smoking and lung cancer story is an interesting one. It's one that has interested me because
Your father basically.
Yeah, all of the
He had a heart
men
attack
in
and he smoked.
Yeah, all of the men in my family smoked cigarettes, and they all died prematurely from smoking-related diseases. So I was very interested in this, and a lot of my early research focused on smoking and trying to reduce premature deaths through smoking. So Alton Ochsner, a famous surgeon at Wash U in the 20s, he was shown one case of lung cancer and told he'd probably not see many of these. And then years later, with a fellow, Michael DeBakey, the world famous
Heart surgeon
from Texas, who was a fellow of Ochsner, they saw 7 or 8 of their patients with lung cancer, and all of them smoked, and they hypothesized that cigarettes were playing a role. But it wasn't until 1950 when Dahl and Hill in London did a case control study to show that there was a significantly higher frequency of smoking among the cases with lung cancer than the controls without lung cancer. And Dahl and Hill then started the British doctors' study of smoking and lung cancer that led to Luther Terry, the Surgeon General, in '64, pronouncing smoking as a cause of lung cancer. And as far as I'm concerned, cigarettes and obesity are the leading avoidable causes of mortality in the U.S. and most developed countries, and frighteningly are becoming the leading avoidable causes of death in the world.
Now, what are the advantages of taking an aspirin every day? You can get over the counter.
Yes.
Statins, you have to have a prescription.
Yes, that's true. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that if you're taking anything for over-the-counter use, it should be short-term. Any long-term thing should be done in conjunction with your healthcare provider, because when you take something long-term, you're worried about longer-term side effects as well as longer-term benefits.
Today, everyone is hearing about low-dose aspirin or a full-dose aspirin as a precaution.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is clear that people at sufficiently high risk of a heart attack, aspirin will prevent the heart attack at a very low risk. But young, healthy people without any risk factors taking aspirin, I'd be concerned that the side effects of aspirin, which include bleeding and GI upset, could be as high or higher than the disease you're trying to prevent. And I think that the healthcare provider is the one who's in the best position to decide that. And I would say that right across the board, because aspirin will reduce the risk of a second heart attack, a second stroke. When given during a heart attack, it reduces the death rate by 23% and has a variety of interesting beneficial effects that we're only now beginning to understand. But I do think that the long-term use of aspirin, as well as any drug, should be under the guise of a healthcare provider's care. I don't think people should self-medicate for long periods.
So you spent how many years at Harvard?
30 or so.
30 years in Harvard, and then you decided that you wanted to go to Florida. How did you get involved with FAU?
Well, I spent 30 years in New York, except for the year at Wharton, 30 in Boston, except for the year in Oxford, and now I'm trying to spend 30 in Florida. I moved to Boca Raton again. My mother was there, my aunt was there, and I kind of took care of them for the last couple of decades of their lives. And I was sort of semi-retiring, and I was able to do some research in the then Charles E. Schmidt College of Biomedical Science. And then about 4 years ago, the Charles E. Schmidt College of Medical Science became the Charles E. Schmidt College of Medicine, and we will be graduating our first class of students in this coming spring. And I'm astonished at the outstanding qualities of these students. They have grade point averages of about 3.8, board scores of about 32, and they're outstanding young men and women who I think will do a lot to, they're competent and they're compassionate.
You've written over 865 articles.
Yes.
3 textbooks.
Yes.
You still play tennis?
Well, my job in terms of the first Sir Richard Dahl Professor and Senior Academic Advisor to the Dean has morphed into what we call dashboard indicators of academic success. So I'm mentoring a lot of the students and young faculty on a one-on-one basis with the goal of trying to achieve these milestones in academic medicine that will improve the reputation of our outstanding medical school.
Are you still doing some research projects today?
I am. I'm doing some at FAU, some at Harvard, some at the University of Wisconsin, and some at Meharry Medical College, where we're trying to reduce disparities in health between racial disparities, which are large.
And any more books?
Not in the offing at the present time.
Now, you've traveled around the world. We've had pictures of you, China, or
Yes.
I mean, so tell me about some of these trips, the reasons for them, and
Well, I was part of an international contingent that was the first group to go to parts of China since 1949. We went shortly after Mao died, around 1981. Our host was Dr. Li Bing, who was the daughter of Premier Zhou Enlai and was the head of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And we helped them design studies in Linshan in the Honan province that showed the beneficial effects of a combination of antioxidant vitamins in reducing risks of stomach and esophageal cancer in this poorly nourished population that had one of the highest risks in the world.
So let's talk about family. Tell me about your children.
Well, I have 3 children, and my son is a rehabilitation counselor. My older daughter is a teacher and a coach, and my last daughter is a psychotherapist and a teacher as well.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
4. Grace Madeline Hennekens, the daughter of Chuck Hennekens, who lives in Plantation, Florida. And then there are Ella Caroline Duffy, Hayden Cole Duffy, and my namesake Charlotte Adele Duffy,
Right,
who live in Wayland, Massachusetts.
Right, we have the pictures of the Duffys over there. Yes. So, the joke was your mother would have been happy that you became a physician, but you never practiced. I mean, you've never been.
That is true. I remember this. A colleague and friend of mine, Tim Johnson, did a 20/20 piece on me, and it was taped, and she saw it, and she thought I looked good. She said, "You have a great smile, just like your dad, but tell me, is there any chance you'll ever be a real doctor again?" Well, the reality is that once I've accepted the reality that it's far better to be over the hill than under the hill, my life has been the best ever. The quality of my life is outstanding. I feel so fortunate to be at the Schmidt College of Medicine mentoring these outstanding young people, not just the students, but the junior faculty as well. I get to play tennis virtually every day, although with my work I'm now playing nights and weekends rather than during the day. But I'm having the time of my life. I'm fortunate to have Caroline Yang in my life, who I think is just has one of the best hearts of anyone I've ever met, and my life is just the best it's ever been. I hope it stays this way for a while.
The Brooklyn Queens, I got to give you the Brooklyn Queens, and the boy who spent and had a lot of honors at Queens College, has joined me today to tell his life story. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure.